Please explain how authors are being exploited by book publishing companies.
Well, as a publisher and an author, I have a unique perspective in this industry. As an author, I can tell you that many authors, particularly scholars, give away too much of their rights to their intellectual property. On average, it may take you as a scholar 5, sometimes 10 years to publish a book, a monograph, single authored monograph. And so all that energy and intellectual effort that goes into publishing a book, authors will often give away that intellectual property and all that energy and effort for no more than 7, 8%, maybe 10% of royalty. That's net royalty after tax and everything else. And so what they give away also, which is more crucial to me, is a copyright. You see, the difference between copyright, that is the ownership of the work that's being produced, and the capacity or ability for the publisher to publish that work. They're separate issues, but often what publishers will do, they'll fuse them as one. They'll essentially say that you're granting me, the publisher, rights in perpetuity, that is forever, usually 70 years after the author passes away, and it can be renewed by the publisher. So in perpetuity, you're granting away the ownership of your intellectual property in your work and the exclusive right for that publisher to be the sole publisher to distribute your work across the world. So what I do is I separate the two. That is, I separate ownership of the work, make sure that the copyright is in my name, and then allow the publisher exclusive right to publish that work for the time that I grant them to do so. At any point, I can pull the plug, as it were, because I own the intellectual property. So there's an important distinction that authors don't really think about or unaware that the two, that is ownership in the work and the ability for the publisher to disseminate the work, are not the same. They're two separate matters. And that's where I think authors get taken advantage of or exploited, because often they give away their ownership and their rights, which I think is very similar to the music industry when you give away your publishing, which is your catalog, right? That is the intellectual ownership of your work, because ultimately that's what's going to essentially feed you over the long haul when ownership in that work will pay dividends for you over the long haul. So to me, the key issue that authors often get exploited by is a misunderstanding or unappreciation for the distinction between ownership of intellectual property that they have created and the ability for the publisher to distribute that work. They're two separate matters that are often fused, and that's where the problem lies.
Are book publishing companies getting into appearances also, or are they only getting a percentage of book sales? Are they getting percentages of any other use of the book by the author?
Well, that is in fact a key question. And so what publishers do, academic publishers, trade publishers, they in fact will essentially spread out the exploitation of the author's work. This is how it happens. And so there's percentages that they get obviously from publishing the work, that is sales from the work, but the sales in several ways. There's the physical copy, that is the hard copy and the paperback. But there's also the ebook, that is whatever is the EPUB file or it is another kind of file that goes on different platforms, whether it's on the Google Play or the Apple Store, or it is on a myriad of electronic publishing sites. And then what the publishers also do is they will serialize the work in terms of these library catalogs and library subscriptions. So they'll put the work inside these subscriptions, either which they own or through an aggregate, that is an independent company that works on their behalf. And they'll also exploit the work in terms of copyright that faculty may use. They may say, look, if you want to use this particular published work that we, the publisher, own, you have to pay a certain amount. And usually what libraries of universities will do, they'll pay a subscription fee, or they'll have essentially, individual scholars or professors or individuals who want to use that work pay a fee for using a portion of the work through a major aggregate like Copyright Clearinghouse, right, which is one of the largest in the country. And so publishers have a myriad of ways which essentially they'll metastasize their ability, they'll spread out their ability to exploit your work in a number of ways. Book clubs. That's great. Right, book clubs, conferences, leasing, that is essentially limiting, let's say, a school district or a group of teachers, or one teacher wants to use the work for learning materials, they'll actually have to pay a fee for that reuse. So there's so many ways, at least 15 ways that a publisher will exploit your work And most authors are unaware of the ways in which this works.
Seems as if the world misunderstands what Vodun is. Please explain what Vodun is and why it is so misunderstood across the world.
Sure. So Vodun or Vodun is often represented in literature, in books, movies, and less extent, in sort of the conversation that happens, if any, online and social media. Voodoo is one of the most misunderstood concepts because often it's tagged to voodoo, whether it's spelled with a double O, V double O, D double O, or it's spelled in some other kind of ways in which it makes it appear as that it's something that is demonic or grotesque, like voodoo, like woo, right? It sort of has that sort of Halloweenish, kind of feeling to it. So voodoo is often referred to as the spiritual forces or deities within the system of African spiritual practice that has its origins within the country of what is now Benin and Togo, among the Yoruba Fombe or Fon people. Now, from what I understand is that voodoo is actually not the divinities or the spiritual forces themselves.
Hold on, before we continue, I want to clarify the pronunciation. So Voodoo and voodoo are two different things?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. So voodoo is actually the system of practices and rituals that are essentially the matrix or the body of knowledge and practice and rituals, right? Whereas the divinities or spiritual forces in Haitian voodoo are referred to as Loa or Loas, whereas in Benin they're referred to as Hun or Hun. And so often what you find in literature, whether it's Wikipedia or other kinds of sources, they represent these spiritual forces as voodoo. But voodoo is not the spiritual force. It's simply it's sort of an umbrella term, right? For the sort of system of knowledge and practices and rituals that embody, right? Essentially the again, the entire edifice, that is the structure, for the system, whereas the individual spiritual forces themselves are referred to as hun, and then there are myriad of them, and here's why. These spiritual forces or energies, they're no different than gravity or or atoms or other things that you can't see with your eye, but we know exist because we have a sense that they do. And so wherever you find, several bodies of water or mountains or hills or certain kinds of forests, secondary forests, primary forests, savannas, you name it, wherever you find these patches in nature, you'll find these forces that are embedded in those parcels, right? And so you have a myriad of names, much like in the Yoruba system, which people refer to as Ifa, but Ifa is one of the spiritual forces used for divination, right? And so Ifa is not the system. The system, from what I understand, is referred to as Isheshe. And even that may be incomplete because what I've discussed with others is that these African spiritual systems, as we call them, us meaning people outside of Africa and outside of the language, particularly the particular language is spoken, we have a way in which we have essentially, even when we try to leave Christianity or Islam or any other sort of Eurasian.
I'm saying we still fuse it.
Yes, yes. So even when we depart from or want nothing to do with Christianity, Islam, we bring the cognitive world from Christianity with us. So by that I mean this: we bring the system, we bring for example, your houses, meaning we bring the temple, we bring the same vocabulary and logic and structures from Christianity and Islam into these systems. So when we think about the Yoruba system, the Yoruba doesn't have a system. They kind of don't have a system. They kind of don't have a spiritual system. What these people have, are essentially, cultural codes and so coded wisdom inherited from their ancestors. And so when I asked the question from my elders among the Akan people, my folks in Ghana, West Africa, what do you call this? They gave me a proverb. And this is classic African folks, right? They said that, what we do, right? What I call spiritual culture, which is a sort of a bridge for something that we can't name. Spiritual culture, they said, is like a cloth. We created it, we wove it, we created it, we wore it, we washed it, and we passed it on to our children. And they do the same thing. Essentially, it's culture without a name. Because there's no need to name something that you live and breathe, right? And so by naming it, we do something that's what European white folks do, right? They have to have these schemas and categories because their thing about knowing is to control it. To know it is to control it, right? And so for many African folks that I'm aware of, particularly through the perspective or the pathway of their languages, they don't have a name for their culture. They don't have a name for themselves. So for example, the Yoruba are not Yoruba. That's what the Hausa people call them, right? Meaning that kind of people, right? The Akan are not Akan, because the Akan were called Tong or Tonowa by the Mande people. Tong or Tonowa means locusts, right? And you know what locusts are? They're pests for farmers because they eat their crops. And so you have intra-African terminologies that are being used to call those people. In other words, Africans have ways of distinguishing, I am this and you're that, or I'm not that because you're this. And the same is true for their spiritual system of tradition. They don't name it, they live it.
So based on all the African terms we have been given to Africans by non-Africans?
Yes, you have these interpolated terms, meaning those that are given from without, like African, Negro, Black, and so on. But then you have intra-African naming. The Hausa called those people Yoruba, which became Yoruba. And then, of course, when folks reach Cuba and Brazil, they refer to it as Lukumi or Nago, right? In fact, in Jamaica, which I just came from Jamaica, actually 2 days ago, you have a place called Nago Hills, right? And so you have these terms being created by Africans. These are intra-African, right, sort of naming, not the externalized, interpolated ones. The Akan are called Tong or Tonoa by the Mande people, right, who live in the Savannah region in West Africa, which means locusts, right, because obviously there's some behavior or character from these Akan peoples that made the Mande people refer to them as locusts, meaning as pesky, right, as troublesome to farmers, right? And so you have intra-African naming, which to me is a deeply understudied and fascinating arena for people to, if they really want to do African history, they have to do intra-African history, meaning what kinds of histories are being created among the encounter and exchange between African peoples on their own terms, literally and metaphorically, right? So that's something that is really undervalued, underappreciated. And so when you think about African spiritual culture, then what I've come to realize is that people don't have names for things that they live, right? So when we call it Yoruba system or the Akan system or Akan religion or Akan tradition, what are we really doing? We are framing what people do organically and without naming, culture without names, as I call it, or phrase it in the English language, that people naturally don't do, right? And so we give it a name and make it a thing rather than a lived experience because we are not in that experience, right? Because if we were, and in the language and in the cosmology, we'd just be living it.
Why does voodoo have such a bad name across the world?
Well, it's no different than Obia, right? Which we know of. It's a pan-Caribbean term, much like voodoo. And Obia is known throughout the Caribbean region, right? And even, it has migrated, for example, to England, where peoples from the Caribbean basin, particularly Jamaica, but not exclusively, have migrated to England and throughout, that particular, diaspora. And so terms like Obia and voodoo, right, which gives it sort of, again, the flair of being something that is the demonic inverse of Christianity, meaning it is the polar opposite of something that's pure, civilized, and holy. Because of a simple fact, African cultural norms and forms have to be the boogeyman, right? Has to be the demonic inverse in order for Christianity to appear pure, holy, and sacred. In other words, it has to be flipped. In other words, think of it this way. Think of it as, you want to make someone feel awful. Then the way you do that is to make them essentially everything that they're not. It's to frame them as everything that they're not. And so in order to make you feel good about what you do. And so it's the same kind of framing, right? They flip it. And they have to do that in order to get African peoples out of their righteous mind and out of their culture, norms, and form, because they know, meaning these European people who became white, they know that their so-called notion of fake or false superiority rests on getting African peoples out of their righteous mind and out of their sense of themselves. Because their sense of self and sanctity and even sanity rests on their power base in terms of who they are. And so by calling it voodoo, it was called voodoo or obia because these were the weaponry against European empire, European slavery, and European predation and cannibalism, right? This was their power source. Planters throughout the Americas, slavers throughout the Americas were uneased and did not sleep well because of so-called obia and voodoo, right? And so by making African people believe that their own spiritual culture, their own spiritual weaponry and technologies were in fact devilish or demonic, and this thing over here, Christianity, is pure, holy, and sacred, is to get people out of their power base. In other words, think of it this way, in a crude but hopefully helpful example. It's like, when children will dupe each other out of their money, they'll say, I'll give you, let's say a 10-year-old is talking to a 3-year-old, and 10-year-old says, you have a nice, piece of paper there, which is a $100 bill. I'll give you all these shiny coins, which are dimes, right? But they're new. I'll give you all these shiny coins, and let's say it's about 100 dimes, right? For, that piece of paper, right? And the child will say, oh, really? All those shiny coins? For this, partly, grayish, green, $100 bill, right? And so the child will take the shiny, quantity of coins for this $100 because the child is what duped into believing that this shiny thing, right, that appears shiny, right, is more alluring than that valuable but older and therefore more ancient, $100 bill that's wrinkly as a great grayish green, and that exchange is made. So that kind of duping, in poor metaphor, but I'm sure your viewers understand, is what happens. Getting people out of their righteous mind is how you get them out of their power base. How do you get them? Essentially, that's how you make someone a slave, right? Slavery, again, is a power dynamic. And in this power of tug of war, you have to make the people who you want power over believe that their cultural norms and forms are their worst enemies. Keyword believe, right? And you do that by making something shiny and alluring and seductive being the what? Frame of weapons for desire, right? But not simply desire, but desire through violence, right? You'll desire this through violence, right? And so it's through that, or those processes, that we end up, people of African ancestry, seeing obia as wickedness solely or only. Yes, it was wickedness for the overseer, wickedness and evil for the planter, right? Giving them a mirror image of who they are, right? Essentially, African spiritualities, in their more, unstained and unfettered form, on their own terms, is not about good and bad, but it's about destroying destruction, right? It is offensive and defensive. It doesn't seek to cause a fight, but if you bring the fight, it will bring the fight back to you. And that's what so-called obia and voodoo did. But of course, these are power bases that these, European white folks were terrified about. In fact, all throughout the Caribbean in the 18th, 19th century, there were at least a dozen or more laws on obia and so-called voodoo punishable by death. Now, you don't enact those laws for something that is superstition.
That's what I want to touch on, man. So if it's such superstition and such BS, why were they so terrified of it?
Because it was real. Planters were vomiting, choking on their own vomit. Planters were not waking up from sleep the next morning. Planters were having their skin just turn, to ash and just crumbling, right? And so they were terrorized, right, by a terror for which they could not stop. Because it wasn't a terror that was simply brought on by bearing arms. It wasn't a terror that was brought on by, axe and machete wielding, insurgentists, right? And you had those in terms of revolts and rebellions. But it was a terror that was unseen but felt. That was known but you can't taste, touch, or see. That is the worst terror. An enemy you can't see is the most terrifying, restricting kind of force that one could have.
And you know what's wild? What I always is that Caribbean. I don't know about America, but well, America too. But most of the leaders that led rebellions were spiritual people, and
Indeed.
even if they were Christians, quote unquote, they seem to still have that African essence in them. So would you argue that they were all practicing African spirituality during their rebellion?
Of course, because again, they were in part or whole their righteous mind, which means they were in, or they were operating from the nuclear weapon of their culture, or cultural, spiritual culture in this case. And so whether it is the Maroons in Jamaica or Suriname or French Guiana or Ghana, what is not Guyana proper, or it's in Georgia or the Carolinas in terms of Denmark, Vesey. I put out the quotation because we don't know if that's his name or not, but that's what we have on the historical record. Or Nat Turner in Virginia, or here in upstate New York, New York State, or all throughout, even in New Jersey, Perth Amboy, which is a major port, for introducing captive Africans into what it became New Jersey. So all across the United States, particularly on the eastern seaboard and in the deep south, you have people who are still within their cultural frame of mind and reference, who are operating from that nuclear power base of it, even in the framing of Christianity, meaning people can go to church and not be Christian. There's a conflation of that going to church or reading the Bible. In other words, I can read the Quran as a scholar. Doesn't mean I'm a Muslim. Right? I can read the whatever version of the Bible, because there's so many. I can read Hebrew texts. I don't have to be a Jew to do that, right? So my point is that we often associate the act of going to a place and reading a certain text or texts with being a member of the theology represented by those texts, and they're false because they provide a cover, a veneer, for people to exist, to be, but again, without getting the sort of gratuitous violence showered upon them, right? And so, that was smart, right? That was wise, right? Because moving around, in rebellious attire is to bring an undue attention to yourself. So yeah, go to the Masonry Church in the plantation, right? Yeah, cross yourself, right? But of course, what you don't know in heart and mind, and particularly deep down, buried in spirit, is what's bubbling, right? What's fomenting. And so to those rebellions and to those revolts, and even revolts in daily act, the poisonings, sabotaging machinery, that is the sugarcane machinery, or cutting down sugarcane early and not processing, it spoils. Burning the sugarcane crop and not, of course, transferring it to the refinery, it spoils. Or the rice paddy, right? So sabotaging, undermining, I don't feel well today, I'm sick, whatever it is. There's a number of ways people revolted. And even when people worked diligently because they knew, again, the gratuitous violence was always, over their heads, on their shoulders, on top of their heads, they in fact would still do so in heart, mind, and spirit, right? Because they knew that, this is flesh. You can do what you want to this. Yes, it pains, but people, African people, had a sense about home, and home was never in a shack or a shed. Home was always, a spiritual place. In fact, one of my favorite proverbs from West Africa says that spirit is our home and earth is our market where we come to do our transactions, right? And so they knew that this is, this temporal, material, mundane life is transactional, right? You and I meet, chop it up, we engage, we relate, but we know that that's our home, right? And so to me, that's liberating theology, if you want one, right? Because it frees you up from being bounded by, I don't want to die, right? That to me is an imprisoning theology, where death becomes, it's a trap, it's a prison, right? Physical death, and therefore harm to the body. And this is why I push back against, books or works like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, where he basically argues that I don't want to lose my body. That to me is a Christian view. That to me is an imprisoning view. That is not an African-based view. Because it says, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to be in prison. I don't want, meaning the jail. I don't want to, I want you to harm or hurt this or maim this, right? I told my daughters, you better get me a good lawyer. Or if I go out, you better bury me properly. Because I'm going out for you. I'm not imprisoned by this, right? And that's an African spiritual culture view, which is liberating. The converse is imprisoning and entrapping. That's the power of dogma. But African spirituality, it frees you from that. Imagine if, folks in this United States and elsewhere out in the world, all, 600 million of us plus, just one day took on that view. It's a wrap.
All right. Can you tell us the origin story of the Dogon people, their knowledge about Sirius B, and why Europeans try to disclaim their understanding of Sirius B?
Great question. From what I know and remember about the Dogon people who live, on the Bandegara cliffs, what if not Mali, West Africa, these are people who actually were not born there, because people are not born on the cliffs or plateaus, but they migrated there in an unknown time. And I'll probably refer your viewers to a number of books that lay out Dogon cosmology, because our time is limited in this, and it'll be great just to have a conversation right after having this common reference. And so there's a book called Conversations with Ogatameli, who was an elder, Dogon elder, these two French anthropologists that had interviewed, I think 1950s, maybe a little earlier, but 1950s or so. And then there's another book, a larger book. The name will come back to me in a moment. It's in my mind, but it's not too clear right now. About the Dogon people. That is really just. It's called the Pale Fox. The Pale Fox, right? And the cosmology is laid out there. And so the Dogon's cosmology has a lot of similarities with the cosmology from ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, right? Where there is this sort of cosmic force, unnamed, ungendered, unknown, that is like this sort of dark matter, right? And out of that emerges, right, these forces, right? And that's really all the world is. Whether it's the universe or cosmos, it's energy and matter, right? Energy makes matter, and matter is filled with energy. Basically, matter is a densification of energy. Everything is energy and force, right? What's true in physics and chemistry is true for these African peoples way, way long ago in ancient times. And so out of this dark matter emerging these spiritual forces, and there's a spiritual force referred to as Ama, that is crucial to these other forces that are extensions of Ama. And so you have a story of essentially one of those forces going awry, right? Think of it like cancer. All cancer is, and I don't want to be too crude, but all cancer is certain cells going rogue, and then of course fighting the body, right? Fighting the body, fighting itself. And so there's a force or forces, and hence the notion of the pale fox, that essentially goes rogue, right? And essentially wants to be the creative force, right? That's sort of the architect. And this becomes the inspiration for Marimba Ani's classic book, Yurugu, right? The notion of Yurugu, the sort of rogue, right, that wants to essentially compete with and be like this creative force of the universe. You have it in ancient Kemet, right? And so that awesome and archaic, that awesome and archetypical battle between Osar and Set, right? That again, these two forces. One wants to take the place, of this grander, more pivotal creative force, and so you have this sort of cosmic battle that goes on. Now, there's much more to it. That's why I referred your readers to these two books, The Pale Fox and Conversation with Ogatameli, because they'll lay out more details in which I can do with you in this time. The Dogon people, in that cosmology, therefore, they have a sensibility about the cosmos, right? Because what happens is, when you live on these high mountains and plateaus, like the Bandegara cliffs, you have a certain perspective, literally and metaphorically. And so it is by the elders having spiritual eyesight, meaning they see not better or worse, but differently, right? Layered with empirical observation. In other words, being on that elevated plateau, you have what say, let's say a telescope has it, because telescopes are usually placed on elevated platforms, right? And so you have that by the cliffs, naturally, right, organically. And then it is what? Long empirical observation on clear nights, right? Which are then ritualized, right? Meaning periodically ritualized, that one can able to see. So you can see in two ways. Training your eyes, right? To be able to what? Sharply see what others can't see because of your elevated platform, and from what? Hundreds of years of doing this, right? And accumulated knowledge over time, right? So this is a really empirical study, really. And then spiritually, right? Being able to what? In the dark nights, without any artificial light, that in the streets or otherwise, impairing, because light, artificial light impairs your vision, whereas clear nights, whether it's Jamaica or in Mali, right, you see in a way that you can't see elsewhere. No cloud, no fog, just really just black cosmos as the backdrop to what? These stars. And then you're able to what? See the formation. And what happens is empirically, you develop what? Patterns, like the Dogon did. You see what star comes in formation, how often, and these observations are married to the agrarian cycle, right? When these grains and crops are available, and you ritualize them by having festivals, right? So these festivals essentially are celebratory markings of these observations that are cosmological but that are real, that then become essentially ritualized, right? Ritualized forms. And so in many ways, this is why African culture is not African culture, meaning it is a culture without a name. Because cosmology, ritual, agrarian life are just tightly bound together. They're tightly woven or braided together in a way that you can't name it one thing. And that's tough for people to conceptualize who are outside of the culture, outside of the language of those people that we call culture. So culture and spirituality are really just these poor substitutes or placeholders, something that can't be named and shouldn't be named, right? Should be lived. And so, Dogon spiritual culture as a temporary placeholder was such that you allow me these observations. So these observations, because they are uncomprehendable to a language and people outside of both. When we come to this debate that was sparked by Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer, well known. I think he taught at Cornell University, where I went to grad school. He argued that it's impossible for these Africans to have known about Sirius B or any other stars or constellation, because they don't have the brain power or the technology. B, and certainly if they did, they must have learned it from Europeans who visited them. Right? Classic Hamitic myth and hypothesis, right? These people are empty-headed, they have no way of knowing. Which, if you read Carl Sagan, what he's really saying is this, and I'm gonna translate him, for your audience, is that we couldn't have known what you've known without our gadgets much later than you did. That's what he's really saying, right? Right? We don't know how you know what you know, because we came to this observation in the 20th century, right? When you have known this centuries and millennia ago. And because you knew it before us, we can't give you any credit, because we took so long to figure out with our gadgets and our technology and our know-how so late in the game, and we want to remain or maintain this hocus pocus that we're better than you, that we're superior to you, right? We have to what gets you out of your righteous mind by devaluing the meaning and even arguing to say that there's no way. But of course, the Dogon people on the cliffs, in their righteous mind, in their cultural base, on their spiritual culture and platform, then it's not a debate. To them, it's not even worth debating or arguing about. It's lived. And so their ritual and festival continues. In fact, on YouTube, you can find some of these dances because they're masked that occasion these festivals and dances, but they only occur at certain times. And it's part of a much more larger cosmology, which may include, because it's part of the larger Mande people, right? May include the Akan people in that cosmology. Another conversation that we can have some other time. But it's a very wide and broad cosmology that stretches across wider West Africa, right? That includes so many people that fall under the Mande or Mandekind umbrella.
I want to talk about your experience with African healers. First question I have, it always intrigued me, right? How did our ancestors become knowledgeable about the use of their environment to heal and protect their mind and bodies?
Great question. Empiricism. In other words, there's a dictum or saying that experience is the best teacher. I disagree. Experience with other people is the best teacher, meaning you don't have to go through it in order to learn from it. This is how it happened. African peoples living in different ecologies. So I'll pick one ecology, dense tropical forest. What they would do and have done and still do is observe which animals go to which plant and decide to eat it or stay away from it. The experiences of those animals tell you two things, broadly speaking. One is what plant life attracts certain animals and repel them, right? So this is great knowledge for what? Hunting. The other knowledge is what do they do with the plants, right? Are the plants, trees, or roots are used to clean? Is it used to as food? Is it used for medicine? And so that provides sort of a laboratory. Think of it as a research and trial and development, indeed, but in nature. And this brings me to a very important point, sort of like a important aside, which is that you don't have to kill an animal, cut it open to know the animal, because that is decontextualized knowledge. A, the animal is not alive. B, the animal is taken apart. And yes, in terms of European and white, ways of knowing, they want to know at the molecular structure, but knowing is really decontextualized, right? They want to know the skin, the parts, the organs. But guess what? These Africans want to know in context, meaning the alive animals in their environment, in their habitat, being themselves. That's how you know, right? So there's decontextualized knowledge, right? Which has its place. But then there's contextualized knowledge.
Hold on, we gotta stop. That's a brilliant point when you think about it, right? Because in regards to being in their natural environment, then you will understand their natural behavior. But a lot of times with these research, they put them in an unnatural environment. They're trying to dictate the behavior, but it doesn't necessarily reflect their true behavior.
Exactly.
I got you.
Exactly. And so, and that's really, generally speaking, the sort of European-based approach to knowledge, that is knowing, which is that break things down to the most basic parts, name them, and then they, through that, they know the whole. But that you can't know the whole out of context. And so Africans say, their idea of knowledge is that in order to know something, we have to know the thing as part of its context, as part of its setting, on its own terms, in its own environment. And that requires what? Deep observation. That requires what? A respect for the natural world. That requires a partnership in the natural world, right? Not seeing nature as the enemy. And so there's a sense that there's a rhythm. And so that approach to knowing is quite different than the decontextualized, laboratory, breaking down the natural parts, and in that way, that knowing is always impartial and complete, right? And that's why all these clinical trials ultimately fail to deliver on the promise of a cure. The products that come out of that may relieve a symptom, but it creates other side effects. And people don't think about it. That is the knowledge production process for a clinical trial to bring a drug to market. Ultimately, is always partial. And it always backfires through the side effects. Because the process of learning, of producing that knowledge that then becomes codified as a medical product or device is always what? From a very partial and essentially unholistic approach to the problem it seeks to address.
So before you continue, right, and I don't mean to change the argument, but when we analyze black people in America, it's an inaccurate analysis because they're in an unfamiliar, hostile environment. So can we argue like people aren't acting in their true nature?
Indeed.
due to their environment and their kind of.
Indeed. In fact, if by true nature you mean an ecology that is ancestral, right? Because we know that the human genome, our genetic makeup, is always interacting with our ecology, our environment. And so that interplay, that intimate relationship between ecology and our genome mean that over centuries, not even centuries, over millennia, over millions of years of maturation. I'm saving for evolution because that's a different thing. Of maturation, right? You have coded bodies that are coded. So if you compare 500 years, a half a millennium, to 5 million years, that's not a comparison, right? In other words, we're not just simply the result of an adaptation or mutation to 3, 4, to 500 years, let's say in the Americas. We have a longer genetic rope that binds us to millions of years of ancestral interaction with our ecology, which is to say that people from the dense tropical forests, let's say West Africa, into West Central Africa, who came to Jamaica or Georgia or New York or Philly or Philadelphia, or became these places, they would still have certain nutritional deficiencies, right? For example, in the West African forests, calcium was a deficiency. Why? Because there was no natural source great natural source of calcium. Because calcium requires, I think, magnesium and vitamin D to metabolize well, and so the forest canopy acts like an umbrella to block direct sunlight, right? That's why people in the forest tend to be short in stature, because and they don't have a cow because cows die in the forest due to tsetse fly. So there are microorganisms and that part of the ecology that essentially inhibits, right, consistent and sufficient sources of calcium, which means that their bones, right, don't grow as large. People in savannah who have cattle, who rear cattle, and have direct sunlight, right? And so people in the savannah tend to be small in stature. Think about NBA players who come directly from Africa to the NBA. Tall in stature. They're from savannah areas, large, right? Or non-tropical, dense tropical forest areas, right? And so ecology has a deep way which it affects people's being dislocated and being removed from those ecologies unconsensually, of course, in the case of African peoples here. And therefore that does create certain mishaps. So for example, I found it odd when I came from Jamaica to the United States, to New York in particular, and I saw people drinking milk like water. We never drank milk like that. If we drank milk, it was used to make like what we call cocoa tea, right? And we used to scald it, meaning we actually would boil it, right? And we'd mix it with this cocoa. But that was for like Sunday breakfast, right? But we never just drank milk with cookies, right? So the idea of cookies and milk was foreign to me, right? The idea of just drinking milk like we drink water was foreign to me. And that's because of the process of coming from, so my folks are from, what is now Ghana and Benin, right? They don't drink milk, right? And therefore, it explains also in terms of disease and bodily reactions to milk, why a lot of people of African ancestry are lactose intolerant. That's ancestral, right? So there is a lot of, environmental disease and ecological damage that have been wrought by the dislodging of people from the ancestral homelands, without choice and without their will. And that produces people who, again, their behaviors and their new normal reflects a certain kind of trauma and dislocation.
All right. I wanted to ask, is the knowledge of healing being preserved or is it dying?
Well, I got an odd response to you on that. It's being preserved, but it's not dying in the way that you think it's dying. It's dying because there's a mythology that when an elder or elders who have that knowledge base transition, that the knowledge dies. That's false and inaccurate. It's being preserved, but in a way that is not in a library, not in an archive. It's being archived in spirit. And so I speak to my grandfather regularly, right, who passed away in 87, excuse me. And so, whatever I want to know, because I'm also a healer, and he was a healer, I'll ask him. I'll say, Grandpa or Papa. In fact, he's here right now. I can feel him in my head. Yeah. I'll say, Papa, how do I do this? I have a client who is experiencing this. What's the best way to do this? And he'll tell me. He say, well, get a bucket of water, get some castor oil, right? And, do this, have them bathing this. Or, grated this vegetable, right? Have them bathing it.
Please explain the communication process though.
Well, in part, there are, those among us who have a certain affinity, right? Who are basically are born. And it's part of the structuration or how African societies were built, meaning you have blacksmith, and families of blacksmith. You have families of carvers, wood carvers, right? They make stools, furniture, utensils, right?
It's a bloodline vibe.
Exactly. So you have what we might call guild, right? Like lawyers, doctors, nurses. You have these associations, families, right? And a trade will run into families, or trades will run into families, and people will essentially, yes, they choose, but some of this is also chosen ancestrally, right? So you have that operating, but then you have people obviously will choose outside of those, guilds or trades. And so you have families who, like mine, who are family of healers, right? My grandfather, maternal grandfather, my mother's, grandmother, her mother, and down the line. And so you have these healing families, right, who will be specialists. But then what happens also in African society is, and I've written about this, you have knowledge that's diffused widely. Meaning, when I went to Techiman, central Ghana, back in 2001, I met young people, 10 years old, young boys and girls who knew about 30 different healing medicines. So then you have, basically what I'm saying is that you have, and this is my argument, you have broadly diffused knowledge, right? For common ailments, right? Common, remedies, right? But then you have specialists who deal with the common, but also the uncommon, and those that are they require much more deeper sense of sensibility and sensitivity. So I think about it in that way. You have broadly based knowledge that's diffused. People, hey, I do this, 30 herbs and medicines. But then you have those situations that are beyond those baseline knowledge that are specialized, right? You go to the specialist. So I'm a specialist. But then you have people that would have common, widely diffused knowledge. I think those two operate in tandem. And therefore, there's not a hierarchy. It's just a matter of specialty and roles.
What's the most shocking experience you had as a healer?
I got stories for you. Not shocking. Maybe, to your viewers it'd be shocking. So I was in Ghana in March 2023, 2 months ago. We're in May now, early May. And while there, someone tried to kill me through spiritual means. No, I mean, they used someone because they wasn't special, but their intent. They wanted to kill me because they had a desire for my former wife, and this person's a woman. So your viewers can put the story together. So a woman wanted another woman, but in order to get me out of the way, for good, according to them, and their own spirit and ill intent. They went about hiring someone. Literally, they paid 2 million Jamaican dollars, which is about 14,000 US dollars. And I have the evidence, so I can back this up. It's not hyperbole. And so I felt something one night, and then the person that was hired, the hired gun spiritual list that was hired to do this, sent me a message on WhatsApp and say, hey boy, and he had some other things to say. I was hired to kill you, and I'm going to destroy you, in 9 days, you're going to cease to exist. But I wasn't worried. To be seriously, because it's a serious matter, and this involved this person going to a graveyard and doing what's called graveyard work. So this is serious business, by the way. In my line of work as a healer, you don't play with this. But they went further because they knew they know I'm a healer, and they know that I had my abilities, and so they did 2 dead bodies, ritual work on 2 dead bodies, one male for me, one for my daughter. And I don't play when it comes to children, especially my children, right? Meaning that if I didn't cease whatever they think I was doing, they added my daughter, meaning, in 9 days, she would become a lunatic. And you can't cure this with European supplied medications. You can't cure this by sending her to Bellevue. This is something that is not cognitive, right? It's not cerebral. Nothing to do with the brain. And so, I went on the offense, and, obviously I'm still here, so it didn't work. But this stuff happens all the time. Where people just, one minute they're here, they're healthy, and then they fall sick. And so that to your viewers would be scary. To me, I wasn't afraid because, I know these things happen. And that's why I said before in an earlier segment that African spirituality is about offense and defense. So I don't do that kind of work, but I know it because I have to know it to be able to deal with it, right? Just like a surgeon or a physician. They know how to kill someone because they have to know how to save someone, at least to the extent, right, that they can suture, parts of the body together, right? Or they can do a transplant, or they can do a blood transfer, right? To that extent, I don't want to give them too much credit because their ability is hinges on other forces being aligned, right? I want to make that very clear. So to the extent that they are allowed to, right, suture someone or a transplant or blood transfusion, to that extent, right? But the doctor has to know both, right? And so the healer, I have to know both how to do that, so I can repair it or I can stop it, right? And so I stopped it, and make sure that was negated. But for a non-specialist or a non-spiritualist or healer like myself, that's terrifying. Knowing that you're gonna die in 9 days, just a countdown, right? And you can't do anything about this except finding someone who can reverse, which is what I did, with some help.
And the help, I just want to ask, is the help, do you receive help from the ancestors? Do you receive help from another living healer?
All the above. All the above. All the above. Because, I partnered with another healer, but my ancestors were a part of it. In fact, ancestors, another healer, because this was serious. I kid you not. I mean, not just me, temporally dying, but my daughter, I don't play that. Any parent, any father, I don't play that, man. I don't play that. But not just for my children, but children in my line of work as a healer. Any client that comes, that to me, that's off limits. Adults will do what they do, right? They can hate, they can be jealous, they can be envious. Work that out. But when you involve children, for me, that's you crossed the line, right? And I'll make I'll send what they send back to them, and let them deal with their own ill intent. That's it. I don't do work that harms or maims, but I will destroy destruction.
Previously, I've heard you've been very critical of some of our leaders, right? So I wanted to ask your views on Marcus Garvey.
Mm-hmm.
Many people have a different view of him. Some see him as a hero, some see him as a villain.
Mm-hmm.
What is your view of Marcus Garvey?
Well, to me, Garvey's not a villain. Garvey deserved his flowers then and now. But as I've argued before in different forums, that all of the notables within the African world, they should be seen three-dimensionally. And even myself or any other person, three-dimensionally. And so by doing so, you allow to see them in full context, right? In all their full regalia and flaws. Because to me, what I find more fascinating is not the regalia, it's the flaws. And here's why, and this is what I mean. I can learn more from the flaws than I can from the regalia. In other words, the regalia is shiny and bright, and so building with others, the UNIA and African Communities League, as a transnational and even a global organization was, tremendous. Yes, there were follies and mistakes. Yes, there were, poor decision making around finances and who to trust. Yes, Garvey, in some cases acted maniacal and within reason, given who he had to trust. And what was at stake, the African world, in a time of heightened and intense European colonization of Africa, right? And so, Steam in its full three-dimensionality, to me, allows for more appreciation, not less. And we can remove villainy from the table, right? That's for the other people who again, want to demean and demolish, the work of Garvey, right? But his flaws are important. Just like Malcolm, getting 4 hours of sleep is and being unhealthy. You've seen pictures of Garvey, right? And so doing the work of one's people is not antithetical to doing the work of family and of self-care. And that's what I mean by I find the flaws more fascinating, because the flaws to me are windows or opportunities to say what we should be working on rather than what we should be glorifying. To glorifying leads to stagnation and comfort. Those are, to borrow, a line from Nas, the cousins of death. When you're comfortable and stagnated, you're close to dying.
I wanted to say real quick, I learned a lot from Garvey. I see a connection between Garvey and Malcolm X Garvey and Thomas Sankara in regards to their shortcomings, right? That we can learn from. I think both were too committed to the cause more than their family. I think you got to find a balance. That's for Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X. But with Marcus Garvey and Thomas Sankara, I think they had the ambition. They overextended themselves. They didn't have the resources and the team to execute the ideas that they had.
I hear you. I'll push back only a bit on the resources, because I might have said this before, in our previous chats, that resources is really an excuse and sometimes a overblown necessity. Yes, resources are necessary, but the most important resources are the people and their commitment. And so if I have a group of committed people, like you can be 10 people, 100 people, 10,000 people, and they're committed, I don't worry about resource, because they're that S word, sharing, right? 5 of us, 10 of us, can stack up in a minivan, right? We don't need, keyword need, a chartered bus, right? I remember when I was part of this African fraternity as an undergrad, a fraternity brothers come and visit. We were like 10 deep in my dorm room. You know what men do, head to feet, 3 of us on the bed, 3 of us on the floor, we had a rug, 2 of us on the couch, we make it work. And so that's about 2 things, people and commitment. We were people, brothers, and we were committed to the organization and each other, right?
But I should have, maybe the wrong word is not, I used the wrong word, not resources. I guess people skilled at what they're supposed to do. Because Thomas Sankara did utilize people, but they weren't skilled, or he didn't have enough time to train them to actually execute the mission.
And that's great. And by the way, this wasn't, necessarily personal to you. I'm saying for folks in general, they made the argument, I don't have the money. We don't have the resources, right? We don't have enough. We need funding, really. And so, look no further, your ancestors. What 401k they had? What, trust fund did they have? What foundation were giving them grants? You see what I'm saying? That to me is an excuse. So again, it wasn't necessarily personal, and I don't want to suggest that, right? But just for our viewers, that that's often a excuse, a blatant excuse for not doing it, right? Let's look further than the ancestors. So people and their commitment, and the truth for Sankara. I'm not sure it was about time as it was about the timing. Someone like Sankara, I don't think it's a matter of time, but timing, right? Much like Garvey, in terms of when they come on the scene, what are the conditions that are there, right? Some people say that Garvey was before his time, right? You hear that kind of saying, or Sankara was before their time, or Lumumba before their time. So I think timing does matter, right? in terms of when people come on the scene with their ideas or with their vision. Sometimes the timing is not there. The conditions, for example, may not be in line with the vision, right? So imagine Garvey in 2020 when Black Lives Matter jumped on the scene. And rather than Black Lives Matter, UNIA. You see what I'm saying? It's a wrap. So sometimes it's the timing of certain ideas and visions that come on the scene because the conditions sometimes dictate what should be. So for me, and this is about strategy, right? I can't fault Sankara because there's a lot that that resonates with me in terms of Sankara's vision. But when you make something like that as a vision public, you bring certain attention. There's a way in which I think about the revolutions in Amilcar Cabral, who was a strategist, but he also was an agronomist. Know the land. He used the land with the people to fight against the Portuguese, right? And so to me, that marriage between knowing the land, agronomy and farming, and knowing the people and their culture, combined together, operated covertly, right? Having these camps, being mobile. So what I'm suggesting is that don't be movement oriented and grandiose. Be maroon. Be guerrilla. Be strategic, right? Be hush harbor, like in the South, right? Yeah, be covert. Bringing attention to yourself undoes or will undo the very thing you're trying to accomplish, right? So I'm saying for Sankara and others, it is saying, we want to do this and making it public, right? We want to actualize this, right? Or Nkrumah telling, again, not picking on Nkrumah again, but he's there, he's on the ballot, on the slate. Telling the British, we want independence now. Independence was granted, but it's not independence, right? That's a concession. So Cabral, he didn't ask the Portuguese for independence. You see? So I think you can learn more from Cabral than Sankara in the sense of strategy and bringing attention to yourself, giving the conditions in which you find yourself. If you are anti-colonialist, if you are insurgent, if you are revolutionary against colonial forces, you can't speak about the very thing you want to them, especially in their idiom. In this is Sankara's case, French, right? And so using the language, using the landscape, and using the culture, that's the winning formula. And being what? A combination of being maroon and being guerrilla and being covert, right? All these successful anti-colonial, struggles were guerrillas, were maroonage, were using the forest, using the landscape. So whether it's in Guinea-Bissau or in Mozambique or in Angola, right, was using those strategies. Think about this. We aggrandize and praise African independence, but most of them were granted. What was that? The ones that weren't, they have a different sensibility about their independence than those that were granted. Think about the neo-colonial relationship, right? So I say that to say that one like Sankara, what I learned from him, all the flaws in terms of strategy, given the conditions and the timing which he came on the scene, but I rate his vision highly. There's lots to love about Sankara. But as I said before, I find more that's useful, as usable from the flaws than from the praise poetry.